The Illuminate Arts and Faith Conference in Chattanooga, Tennessee wants to help you find your tribe. Do you get way too excited about quoting Wendell Berry or C.S. Lewis in conversations with coworkers? Does your Spotify playlist include hymns, a little jazz, and a whole lot of Andrew Peterson? Join your tribe at Illuminate March 31 and April 1 for education and inspiration from speakers Russ Ramsey, Douglas McKelvey, John Hendricks, and others. Find a complete list of session topics and ticket information at southern.edu/illuminate.
In 2024, I set out to meet as many poets as I could and spend an hour with each one. I got more than I bargained for, more insight, more clarity, more hope. It's proved to be one of the richest highlights of my life. 17 writers, 17 deeply human conversations that made me sit up and pay attention. Franz Kafka once said, if the book we're reading doesn't wake us up with a blow to the head, what are we reading for? A book must be the axe for the frozen sea within us. And that's what I hope this new book will do. I hope it wakes us up, my friends. I hope these conversations will be the catalyst for something to be reawakened, re-enchanted, and reinvigorated. It's called An Axe for the Frozen Sea, Conversations with Poets About What Matters Most. I'm Ben Palpin, and I hope you'll come and listen in as I spend a little time with poets like Lucy Shaw, Malcolm Guite, Dana Gioia, and Lee Young Lee. Pull up a chair at the table as we dig into what it means to write well and to live well. An Axe for the Frozen Sea is now available from Rabbit Room Press. Visit the store at rabbitroom.com, or better yet, ask about it at your favorite bookseller.
Welcome to the Habit Podcast, conversations with writers about writing. I'm Jonathan Rogers, your host. Jen Pollock Michel is the author of 3 books, most recently Surprised by Paradox, The Promise of And in an Either-Or World, which received Christianity Today's Award of Merit in the category of Beautiful Orthodoxy. Here's what Wynne Elliott said about Surprised by Paradox. What do you call a book that rattles our comfortable certainties while somehow leaving us sturdier and more joyful? A book that dances in the mysteries without going mushy or cynical. A book that stubbornly insists we find God in the kitchen as much as the cloister. I call this book a paradox. I call it a wonder. Jen Pollock Michel, thank you so much for being on the Habit Podcast.
I am so excited to be here.
You are a person who's done a lot of thinking about paradox. Your most recent book was Surprised by Paradox. And how does coming to grips with paradox make one a better writer? Surely you've done some thinking along those lines.
Well, truthfully, when you sent that question, I was like, that is a really good question. I don't know if I've always thought about it in terms of my writing life. I've thought about it a lot in terms of my spiritual life, but it reminded me of Alan Jacobs' book, How to Think. Uh-huh. And I have really appreciated that book and how he talks about thinking is not just like an intellectual exercise, that it is a function of moral character. And I think paradox has the promise of forming the kind of virtues in us that we need, not just for good thinking, but for good living. So there's a lot of curiosity that's required for paradox. I think there's humility that's required for paradox. I think there's patience and a patient paying attention to things. So that makes you a good writer because those are the qualities. I mean, those are the virtues, truthfully, that you need for good writing. Yeah. That was kind of initially what came to mind.
I haven't read that Alan Jacobs book. I need to because I hear great things about it. And so he talks about writing as the moral dimension of thinking.
He does, and I think we see that, don't we? Like kind of in where we are civically, like in our society. Yeah. Just all the fracturing and the lack of charity and the kind of culture of outrage. I think good thinking, when you think about the moral dimension of good thinking, all of that is required, right? Like kind of thinking the best of a person who disagrees with you, like sustaining attention long enough to hear them out, and to understand their position, the best of their position, not just the caricature of their position.
Right. Yeah.
Isn't that wonderful? I think there's a lot of...
Yeah, it's great.
Yeah.
I can't remember if I've said this on this podcast or not, but it's something I say often enough that I probably have. But Aquinas said that the great enemy of truth is self-interest. Where I get my idea of what I want to be true, and I'm not open to what's actually real and true. And I think that's must be the same thing Alan Jacobs is saying.
And Jonathan Haidt, is another person I think who's doing really interesting work on this. The righteous mind. He talks about we make our moral reasoning is more a function of intuition, and then you come to the reasoning after your intuition. You just sort of confirm what you think to be true in a very gut level, visceral sense. And I think that Aquinas quote sort of taps into that a little bit, of just a confirming what you want to be true. Can
you give us a working definition of paradox?
I can, yeah. I think it's interesting because when I first started writing the book, I thought I was writing a book kind of more about mystery. And my editor said, no, I think this is really about paradox. And when I think about the differences between those, mystery is kind of we don't really, this is a vague kind of nebulous concept or idea. And paradox is not that. Paradox is actually an assertion of truth. It's just a truth that seems self-contradictory. Where you have to hold a couple of things in tension. And there are paradoxes that are more, if we think about in Scripture, there are paradoxes that are a little bit more just paradoxes of language, so that the first shall be last and the last shall be first. Well, how can both of those things be true? This doesn't seem to make any sense. And when you think about it long enough, what Jesus is saying, but there are paradoxes that are much harder to untangle when we assert that Jesus is both God and man, fully God, fully man. So paradox isn't the moderation of two things that seem self-contradictory, kind of half God, half man, if we were to think about Jesus. No, fully God, fully man. And I really appreciate Chesterton on paradox because he, in his book, Orthodoxy, and I think this is just such a wonderful way to think about it, he talks about paradox as an affirming of the white and the red and never the pink,
Yes.
And he says, the church, do you know that quote? It's so wonderful.
I was just about to bring it up, actually.
Oh, really?
Yeah, when you started down that path, but you're doing great. Keep trucking.
I think that's, he talks about, the church's hatred of pink. And so a lot of times we want to moderate things. You want to kind of find that compromise, middle road position, but that's not paradox. Paradox is the affirmation of these two things that seem like you can't hold them to be true at the same time.
Yeah. As distinct from just are you drawing a distinction between a verbal paradox and something that goes deeper than that? Is that what you're getting at?
Well, I don't necessarily do that in the book. I've been helped by some people. It's funny because after you write a book, you still keep learning about the thing you just wrote about.
Oh, sure.
So somebody actually introduced me to a guy named Austin Freeman who wrote his dissertation on paradox at Trinity Evangelical Divinity School. And he was the one who kind of helped me think about the different kinds of paradoxes. He says that there are 3 different kinds of theological paradoxes. I'm not an expert on those very sophisticated nuances of paradox, but I think so in the book, I don't necessarily talk about the difference, I guess. Mm-hmm. But although there are differences.
Okay. Yeah. Your subtitle to your book is basically leaving behind the either or and picking up that both and or something along those lines. Mm-hmm. Forgive me, I don't have it right in front of me. But so what happens when we move from an either or mindset to a both and mindset? Yeah,
I think an either or mindset is kind of a constricted constructed, sort of, I would say unimaginative, and by virtue of being unimaginative, probably faithless positions sometimes. I talk about how really the book, inauspiciously started in a counselor's office, where I was in a hard relationship with a member of my extended family. And what I couldn't figure out was, like, how do I go forward in this relationship? And I kind of went to the counselor thinking, like, well, here are the two alternatives, right? Either I sever this relationship because it's so dysfunctional, or I just suffer all the dysfunction and the lying and just pretend it's not happening so I can love this person. And the counselor said, do you think there could be more alternatives than that? And it was such a simple, obvious question, but I thought, how often do I actually do that in my life? I sort of reduce things to, these two kind of options, two alternatives. And I actually, in my spiritual life, prayer sort of is like offering to God those two options. Do I go? Do I stay? And he's like, neither. D. You gave me A, B, and I'm going to give you K as the answer.
Right.
And so I think if I don't think that everything is a both and. I want to be clear about that. But I think we need to be able to enter into the possibility that our imagination is constricted, limited, and there are possibilities beyond what we can imagine. And sometimes that both and is the position of imagining those different possibilities. I often think it's the both and is the position of sustaining tension and dissonance, which is something that I don't really like to do in my life. I like things to kind of be easy and tidy and neat, and I want to know that I'm doing the right thing, and that I'm on the right way, and I think the both and position, it doesn't let us resolve things as neatly, but it is the way of faith often.
I think you make a great point, because the both and, I think, to move toward both and, feels like you're moving towards some sort of squishiness or loosey-goosey or whatever, taking the easy way out, so to speak. And you make a great point when you say holding those things in tension is not the easy way out.
No.
It's difficult.
Right. And trust me, I think there are people that would use the both and as a kind of slippery slope, like a theological kind of mushiness. But I think that is the difference between just talking an affirmation of mystery versus an affirmation of paradox. I do think that paradox helps us to affirm things that are true. So it's not just that we affirm things that are unknowable, but we affirm things that are true. The tension is in the understanding of that truth, that it just doesn't kind of fit our categories, and our sort of neat, kind of easy, tidy formulations.
Yeah. It's the, how to put this? I mean, it feels, sometimes when we talk about both and, it feels like, we're moving towards some slippery slope toward relativism or something. But on the other hand, if the truth turns out to be both and, then you've got to hold of that truth. I mean, you can't, what am I saying here? You're not getting on a slippery slope if it's true. You're not getting mushy if that's what the truth turns out to be.
Right. And I just love that, you think about like the incarnation, the ultimate sort of paradox, and how many centuries the Christian church had to wrestle through that, to kind of articulate what that meant, wrestle to understand it, wrestle to articulate it, wrestle to understand the implications of what that meant for understanding who God was. Like, they were doing the hard work of thinking. And I think that's the beauty of paradox, is it invites us into that kind of participatory kind of role. Sometimes I wish, truth were just sort of handed to me like in these nice, easy, like you open it up and, it's IKEA furniture, put it together.
Right.
Even a dummy can do this. And I think there's something way more beautiful that's offered to us as a Christian, particularly. I believe that.
Yeah. Well, I have... here's something I want to talk through with you since you've done more thinking about paradox than I have. I've often here and there made the case that story is a great way to help people grasp paradox in a way that, some sort of more formal, a sermon or an essay can help somebody grasp paradox. Because there's something about the way stories are structured and, the idea of the eucatastrophe and things like this that lends itself to helping us grasp things that are really hard to. I mean, by definition, a paradox is hard to work out rationally or with our reason. But what you tell me? I mean, is that maybe I'm not being generous enough to more formal forms of writing than storytelling. How important is, for instance, also I should point out that Jesus, in communicating paradox, told fictional stories. But anyway, what position do you take on that in terms of, are there other good ways besides storytelling to convey paradox?
I mean, I think you're right. I think you're right to say that if we wanted to rely just only on kind of reasoned assertions and propositional truth, like we'd end up kind of in a circle, you know, like we could say these things, we can assert, these truths, but that doesn't necessarily mean that we're any further into understanding them. So I think you're right to say that there are other ways. And I think the Bible makes incredible use of narrative and image and symbol and story. And I was actually just rereading for a talk that I'm giving. Hans Boersma has a book. He's a professor at Regent College in Vancouver. And he talks about how theology has suffered from like a lot of control. Like we want to rationally, we rly on our reason and we want everything sort of understandable and systematized. And he said, we need to actually recover use of narrative and image and symbol. And that sounds true to me. I wish I could remember the quote, but I'm staring at my, a book by Robert Alter, who's a Hebrew scholar and not a believer. And I think he's probably Jewish. I'm not sure. But I don't know that he's a believing Jew, maybe. But anyways, he's written a lot about how striking it is that so much of the Old Testament is written in prose. And he says that allows us to kind of grapple with the complexity of what it means to be human. And I think that seems true to me, that as you kind of like you think about like the story of Jacob in the Old Testament, and there's a lot that we have to kind of puzzle over. Like, was he a good guy or was he a bad guy? Yeah. And there's no explicit kind of statement on his moral virtues or vices. We have just this collection of stories. And again, I think it allows us to sort of participate in a different way. It engages us in a different way. So I think I'm with you that we kind of find a limit. Propositional truth is limited, and story has a lot of possibility, which is why I really think the task of Christian writers, I'm excited actually to see a lot of Christian writers returning to story as kind of as the more primary medium of communicating truth. I think we've been nervous about that. I think a lot of writers are nervous to share their own stories. Like, is that so self-indulgent and so self-focused? And I mean, it certainly can be.
Sure.
But it can be an incredibly powerful way of articulating truth that can't be sort of neatened and tidied into those propositional statements.
Yeah. We have in our head the idea of what authority ought to look like. And I mean, I'm borrowing from N.T. Wright here when he says, people who think of themselves as being really serious about the authority of Scripture Well, if you're serious about the authority of Scripture, that one thing you have to do is take Scripture on its own terms, and
Yes.
not so, my idea of authority is somebody's going to tell me what to do, and therefore I look to Scripture to give me a list of rules. But what if, I mean, I don't know where this is that N.T. Wright says this, but he says, it's like you go to your drill sergeant expecting to be given your orders, and he says, "Once upon a time," and so if we're serious about the authority of Scripture, we have to take it as on its own terms, which much of the time is story or poetry, and sometimes it's lists of do's and don'ts, but not all that often. I mean, as a proportion of what's there.
It's interesting. I have had so many conversations about this with my 17-year-old son, who's actually in a period of just kind of examining his faith, and asking really rigorous intellectual questions. And I think that's a really important. I think it's really important to do. I'm glad he's doing it, and I'm glad that we're able to have all these conversations with him. But one of the things he has been asking me is like, why didn't God make it easier? Like, why not just give us a book? Like that for it's universal truth for all time, like for every, and in one ways we have that book, but in other ways we have a book that's so, it is enculturated. It comes to us from a particular time and from a particular people group. And so like you look at the Old Testament, there are some hard things in the Old Testament. Like, why didn't God just sort of say like slavery is wrong, end of story? Like, why not that from the very beginning? And that's not what we have in Scripture. And we often really want that. But I think we have a way more beautiful book. I think we have a wiser book. I think we have a book that is actually forming in us the virtues that we talked about at the very beginning, the virtues of thinking and the moral character that's required for thinking. And thinking is a part of faith. It's not the whole of it, right. But I think it's a part of it.
Yeah, that's so much good stuff. All right, switching gears a little bit. I've been looking at your back and forth with Sean Smucker that y'all do on your blogs. Tell me how. So he writes these Dear Jen notes, and you write Dear Sean notes. How did that get started?
That got started from a Twitter conversation last summer. I think I might have responded to something he said. I don't know. I was curious how he was talking about his domestic life and his professional life as a writer. And it just sort of piqued my curiosity, because I think a lot of times women writers have that conversation. Like, how do I sort of balance my domestic obligations and my professional ambitions? And I was like, oh, here's a guy who's talking about that. And he's got 6 kids. Yeah. And then to kind of learn a little bit about his story that, when writing is lean, he's driving Uber for Uber. And so it just came from there. And I said to Sean, would you be interested in just hosting kind of a epistolary conversation on our blogs? And he was like, yeah, that sounds great. And for me, letters is like such a low stakes kind of writing. Yeah. I just get so tied up into knots. I mean, it's like as soon as I sit down at the computer and it's like, now's the time to work on the book, I'm just, I seize up. Like, I have nothing to say, but like, I can say, or whether it's a book or an essay or something that's formal and I'm going to have to turn it into an editor and lots of people are going to read it. Whereas a letter just feels like there's a lot of room in it to kind of be exploratory and not be definitive on anything. And I've been really appreciating the conversation.
Well, it's just fun to have that little glimpse. I need to provide a link to that in the show notes for this, because it's really been fun to see 2 writers talking about kind of whatever's on your mind, as you said, and it's pretty wide ranging stuff. One thing I learned, I've learned from this, is that you're a Capon fan.
I am.
Robert Farrar Capon, yeah. His book,
Devotee, right?
Oh my goodness! The Supper of the Lamb has probably had more of an impact on my writing life in the last of anything else I've read in the last 5 or 10 years. I just love that book. So I'm glad to know you love it too.
I do. I reread it over Christmas because I was moving into a season of a lot of cooking. So I thought, I just need to remember why this is important. I need to just have like a vision for why this matters. And so I'm like, okay, I've got to reread The Supper of the Lamb.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, his the way he awakens the reader to the thinginess of things, to loving things for their own sake and on their own terms, which is a little bit what we've been talking about in some of these other matters. Receiving the truth as it comes to us, and the facts of the world as they come to us, rather than thinking about how we wish they were different. It's just made a huge impact on me. I love his work.
One of the things that I was mentioning to Sean in a letter was just this vision of wholeness, like to his work. Like what he's commending is a vision of wholeness for the maker. And that's a word that I've been using a lot recently because I think I'd like to think of myself more as a maker than even as a writer, because there's so many things I'm making in my life. I'm making books and, all kinds of writing sort of things. I'm making that, but I'm making a marriage, I'm a partner in making a marriage, and I'm making in terms of the parenting that I do with my children. I'm actually making a home. Like I have a house and I'm trying to make it a space that is welcoming to people. And I'm making things at church as I direct a variety of different things, a magazine, I'm an editor there. And so just, one of the things that Capon had said was that, the eye of creativity is the eye that conceives all things into loveliness. That was a phrase that had struck me. And I thought, that's a vision for all the making that I'm doing, whether I'm standing at the stove or whether I'm sitting at my laptop. I'm conceiving things into loveliness, imagining the lovely world that God has made and that God will remake.
Yeah, that's and in that I think it's in the same part of the book. He says, boredom he talks about boredom as the great enemy of goodness. Really, I mean, the eye that can look on the beauties of the world and be bored is in trouble. Well, that's I just love that stuff. Making, can you say, just give me an idea of why you find the word making so helpful?
Well, making, go ahead.
I was going to say, so helpful, especially with regard to, how does that reframe your conception of yourself as a writer when you think this is just another thing that I make?
Well, it helps me to remember that I'm made in the image of a maker, and so making feels like something that directly connects me to who God is, in the beginning, God made. And so as opposed to just writing, and I also think it helps me see things less in competition with each other. That, my writing life isn't competing against my domestic life. I am making. All of these things are making. And whether or not, and I also don't know what publishing will hold for me in future years. I mean, I can't say that I'll be writing in the same way in 10 years. I mean, I hope so. I mean, I hope. But who knows, but I know, and I think a lot of times we think that, well, if this thing ends, then that's the end. Right. Well, whether or not publishing ends for me, I will still be making. And there will also there's going to be an expiration date on my domestic life, in the sense that we're next, actually this spring, we're sending number 2 off, 2 will be gone and 3 will still be at home. So, my domestic life is going to change and it's going to evolve, but I'm always going to be a maker. And I think it's just helping me to imagine so broadly this kind of idea of calling. It's helpful to me. Yeah.
And as I'm sure you know, the word poesis that we get poetry from just means making. so that a poet is a maker.
No, I didn't know that, actually.
Well, there you go.
Thank you.
Yeah, Phil, that's I can't put my finger on why that matters so much to me, but I just love the fact that a poet is just a maker. I guess it just feels, kind of like it just feels so much more down to earth than poetry, which doesn't. I mean, I realize any poet will tell you that it really is an earthy endeavor. But the word poetry, we have these highfalutin ideas about it, and but the idea that it's the same poesis is what's used to describe cabinetry as well as poetry.
Mm-hmm. And you can make your bed.
Yeah, that's right.
You can conceive your bedroom into loveliness by making your bed.
That's right.
Spoken like a true mother.
That's right.
But
yes.
You're right. It has arms big enough for the ordinary and the small, and it makes what feels very cosmic into something beautifully ordinary.
Yeah, that's right. Okay, well, I want to wrap up with the question I always wrap up with, and that is, who are the writers who make you want to write?
Mm-hmm. I mean, I read a lot of spiritual writing, because that's the kind of writing that I do. I love writers who can texture spiritual writing with real life. Mm-hmm. And so, the only blog I subscribe to is Lori Ferguson Wilbert. Uh-huh. And I love her writing. I've read her book that's forthcoming, so I'm really grateful for her. I just feel like she draws people into a textured, material, physical, earthly life as much as a spiritual one. And I would say one of my favorite books is Win Collier's Love Big Be Well. I don't know if people are familiar with that. I feel like that book needs to be on everybody's shelf. And it's fiction, but it's spiritual writing that's just textured. It's letters of a pastor to his congregation. And it just, I don't know, it has an earthiness to it. And I also love Lauren Winner. She's kind of a favorite writer. I'm often opening. I have to say, I think it was this book, Surprised by Paradox. I kind of got stuck on the introduction. I'm like, how did Lauren Winner start wearing God? I'll open that and try to, imitate some of the things she's done. So I can only think of nonfiction people, which is bad, which sort of reveals my bias towards nonfiction. A nonfiction writer that is not a writer on faith is Caitlin Flanagan. I don't know if readers or listeners are familiar with her. You don't know her?
I don't know her work, no. I think somebody else has mentioned her on this podcast, though.
Okay. I think she has several books out. She's an essayist as well, so you can often find her in The Atlantic is where I read her a lot. She had an essay back in December, which was incredible, on the abortion debate. And she's doesn't necessarily draw the same conclusions as I do, but she is so brave. She's so unequivocal in her writing. And I love that, because I think it's hard to do. It's hard to be, very direct and bold and brave and say, no, this is what I think is true. And what she essentially says in that essay is, while I'm an abortion supporter, there's no doubt to me that the abortion is the taking of a life, and it's an act of violence. And I mean, this is published in The Atlantic.
You're talking about the essay "Losing the Rare and Safe, Legal and Rare." Is that the one you're talking about?
I have it.
No, that would have been just a month ago. Is that?
I think I have the dishonesty of the abortion debate, but maybe it was titled something different in the print magazine. Sometimes I find that print versus online.
Because it turns out I have read her, and I thought that was a great essay.
So it's probably the same. It's the same one. I'm sure it's the same one, because I think it came out in the December issue.
Yeah.
I have a lot of admiration for people who can write well, but not just well in the sense of, these beautiful sentences, but persuasively and very emphatically.
Yeah. It's refreshing to find a writer who loves who loves reality and wants to help their readers align with reality, even when it turns out that their understanding of reality is different from mine.
Right.
Yeah. All right. Well, Jen, thank you so much for being on The Habit.
Yeah, you're welcome. Thanks for having me.
Well, let's do it again someday.
That sounds good.
Great. Thanks. Bye.
Bye-bye.
The Rabbit Room has partnered with Lipscomb University to make this podcast possible. Lipscomb has graciously given us access to their recording studio in the Center for Entertainment and Arts building. We're so grateful for their sponsorship, their encouragement, and the good work they do in Nashville. Special shout out as well to Jess Ray for letting us use her song Too Good as part of this podcast. Visit jessraymusic.com to hear more of her beautiful songs.
The Habit membership is a library of resources for writers by me, Jonathan Rogers. More importantly, The Habit is a hub of community where like-minded writers gather to discuss their work and give each other a little more courage. Find out more at thehabit.co.
This podcast was produced by The Rabbit Room, where art nourishes community and community nourishes art. All our podcasts are made possible by the generous support of our members. To learn more about us, visit rabbitroom.com, and to become a member, rabbitroom.com/donate.
If you've enjoyed this podcast episode, consider joining the Rabbit Room membership. Your membership helps sustain this community, funding everything from publishing and podcasts and theater productions to events and programs that support artists who create with a Christ-centered vision. We'd love to have you on board. Learn more at rabbitroom.com/member.